Church the Feast of the Dormition. This is August 15th, and this commemorates and celebrates the Mary's peaceful death, her entrance into death as one of peace and tranquility, and her participation in salvation. So the prayers that I've chosen this morning come from that tradition, just to sort of connect us to that broader church. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll share screen with you all and call that up for us. There we go. All right. So Benum Christinet, and welcome back to all of you. It's wonderful to see you all again this morning. We begin with our opening prayer. O joy of all who are troubled, patroness of the persecuted and sustainer of the hungry, consoler of wanderers, harbor of the storm-tossed, visitor of all the sick, protectress and patroness of the weak, staff of the aged. O Mother of God on high, you are most pure. Hasten, we pray, that your servants may be saved. And that comes from a 13th century prayer of a petitioning to the Blessed Mother. And we'll conclude with prayers from that same prayer service. So our reading today comes from chapter 2, page 42. For those of you who have the book and would like to follow there. The psychosis of denial and projection is the inevitable outcome among those who have embraced a pseudo-theology that tells us we are sinners in the hands of an angry God. For if we are to believe that the God before whom we search our hearts is eagerly looking for a reason to condemn us, we will inevitably suppress and project our most negative traits onto others for fear of the condemnation that would follow if we admit them of ourselves. However, it is only through a sustained interior gaze that the contemplative comes to the joyful realization that grace is amazing precisely because humanity is capable of such wretchedness. We are otherwise left with a mediocre grace, or what Dietrich Bonhoeffer called cheap grace, which is no grace at all. And here for your reflection, I have a beautiful icon of the Dormition of Mary. All right. Our second reading extends from page 42 to 43. The expulsion from Eden is thus not ultimately a tragedy, but merely a prelude to the divine embrace of the Incarnation. The contemplative intuition that God already embraces us is at once an intuition about how the story of exile ends. We are able to see the whole drama of salvation history, the unfolding of our own interior conversion in light of the gospel. Exile ends in embrace. Sin ends in grace. Death ends in new life. Indeed, with Dante, the contemplative knows that the history of human egotism unfolds not as a human tragedy, but as a divine comedy. How then might a contemplative reading of the Genesis account of Eden help to frame our understanding of the movement of the Christian interior life? And that will become the subject of the next section we look at starting next week. For those of you who are not able to remain with us for the conversation, a closing prayer. Rejoice, Virgin most pure, honored scepter of Christ the King. Rejoice, from you the mystical vine sprouted. Rejoice, gate of heaven and unburnt bush. Rejoice, light of the world. Rejoice, joy of all. Rejoice, salvation of the faithful. Rejoice, protectress and refuge of all Christians. Rejoice, O Lady, now and forever. Amen. Rejoice, glory of the whole world. Rejoice, temple of the Lord. Rejoice, overshadowed mountain. Rejoice, refuge of all. Rejoice, golden candelabra. Rejoice, precious glory of true believers. Rejoice, Mary, Mother of Christ, our God. Rejoice, paradise. Rejoice, divine altar. Rejoice, entryway. Rejoice, all golden hand. Rejoice, hope of all. Amen. Okay, so as always, I open the floor to whatever questions or thoughts anyone might like to share. By all means, go right ahead. And because you span a couple of screens, if you could raise your little electronic hands, that would be great. I see, okay, Karen, your hand is up.
Good morning, Karen and John.
Hi, John. Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
My question, I grew up on the East Coast in the Catholic Church, and they were still in the Dark Ages, I mean, even after Vatican II. But then when I moved west, a more progressive church handed out New Testaments, and then later I received the whole Bible, the New Testament. And so I'm reading in Genesis where it talks about the descendants of Adam, and it gives to the seventh generation, gets to Enoch.
Mhm.
So my question has been why, what in the translation makes people say that this part of Genesis is a myth? Because I'm reading your book, and the next section is the myth of Eden. So
That's right. No, thank you. It's a larger question that has been taken up on the last about 250 years or so, basically since the Enlightenment. And what has basically come of that are a series of modern tools that we've been able to develop in the area of biblical studies that have allowed us to understand like never before in Christian history the idea that the Bible is more of a library of books than a single book. And within the context of that library, we have all different kinds of literature that we encounter. Um, what we've learned, and so some of that would be history, some of that is like poetry, as in the Psalms, there's wisdom, there's genealogies, there's prophetic literature, and so forth and so on. And among that library of different types of literature that we discover in the Bible, some has been understood and recognized as myth rather than, say, history. Now, the default, if you want to say, and incorrectly so, the default for many Christians when reading the Bible has been to assume two things. One, that is that everything we read is historical. And two, that if you make the claim that something is not historical, that somehow becomes a denigration of the Bible, that somehow means that it's not true. So when we use the language of myth around certain texts within the Bible, we're not claiming they aren't true. What we're claiming is that revelation is being told through a so-called fictional narrative. So, for example, when Jesus tells his parables, which are mostly to teach people about the nature of the kingdom of God, right? Many parables are, to what can I compare the kingdom of God? And it is like, and then he'll tell the story, say, of the prodigal son, or tell the story of an unfaithful steward. We know that all of those parables are actually fiction. They aren't really accounting for real life circumstances. There really was no prodigal son. He invented the story. But the truth being conveyed through that fictional story tells us something truthful about the nature of the kingdom of God. So that in many ways, when we say that we've discovered and realized certain texts within the Bible to be mythical, we mean something very much like the way the parables are fictional, that they're not actual historical stories, but nevertheless convey the truth about something, and in some ways convey the truth in a deeper, richer, and fuller way than mere history ever could, because history becomes seen as just sort of the layer of what's perceived by the physical eye, whereas mythology is what's perceived by the spiritual eye. It's what theology sees in its perception and its understanding of what the physical eye can only see on the surface. So what we've realized is that virtually everything in Genesis prior to what we call the Abraham cycle, or the stories that begin to talk about Abraham, are in the realm of mythology. So that would include the two stories of creation, which are put side by side. Many of us think there's only one story of creation, but in fact, there's two that were written about 300 years apart and have been edited side by side. One is that beautiful opening that we see in Genesis 1, let there be light, and all of that. And the other one is the story of the creation of Adam and Eve with God walking in the garden. And you'll notice there's two very different images of the divine side by side. One is, God is this all-powerful, transcendent, inaccessible voice who just effortlessly brings about creation. And then the other one is presenting a very anthropomorphic image of God, the one in which God walks with us, talks with us, is very intimate, right? So those were written roughly 300 years apart, and a later editor united those two stories together in Genesis 1 and 2. But the mythological stories would also include things like the Tower of Babel. There is no tower that, in fact, no matter how high, could ever reach the heavens. That is an ancient assumption about heaven being above us and hell below and earth somewhere in the middle. And it's built on those primitive notions or cosmologies. And so the Noah and the Ark would be another example. So virtually everything that we read up until the time of Abraham has been understood in the last 200 or 300 years as really mythological stories that convey deep theological truths, much like Jesus's parables would. As we explore the so-called myth of Eden, as I'll talk about it, I will help to tease out and explain why it's important for us to recognize that, because once we see that is in fact, look, if you're reading a story and you misunderstand the genre of literature that it is, you're almost certainly going to misunderstand the meaning of the text. Take, for example, if you were reading Lord of the Rings and assumed it was actual history, you would be led to believe that in fact there are dragons and wizards in the world and so forth with magical powers and so on. And that would be a completely incorrect understanding of that text. But when we see it under the genre that it is, a kind of classic mythology or a fantasy novel, now we understand that those dragons actually represent symbolically real forces in the world, military forces and so forth, and that the story is really about the power of friendship to prevail through thick and thin in horrible times and so forth. And we can see the deeper meaning without getting caught up in the false assumption that the details are historical. And that's the way we're asked to understand mythology, not to denigrate it to a fable or something that isn't true, but rather to understand that revelation happens in and through mythical stories as much as history, as much as miracle stories, as much as poetry, as much as song, as much as art. So a final example, if we were to walk through a museum that had an exposition of images of Jesus throughout history, we might see some of those images of Jesus dressed like a Byzantine emperor, or some like a shepherd, and others he might be white or African American or Asian. Others he might be dressed in modern clothing like the poor and so forth. And all of these depictions of Christ, we would look at them and we would never think to ourselves, well, that artist who depicted Jesus in an emperor's garb is a liar. They're trying to deceive us. Jesus never dressed like a Byzantine emperor. Of course, we know he never dressed like a Byzantine emperor. But what gets expressed through that depiction of Christ is this is Christ the King. And so we dress him in human kingly dress to convey something that is true about Jesus, that he is king of the universe, so to speak, right? Lord of all, or Pantocrator, to use that term. And in many ways, what we see in the Bible in some of our literature are literary artistic presentations, where we don't have to take what we see on the surface as literally true, but we plunge a little deeper and see, oh, the way they're depicting God, the way they're depicting the relationship between divine and human, as in Eden, is actually speaking something deeply true, not only about who God is, but who we are in relationship to God. So that's how we'll be exploring the value and the meaning of the Genesis myth of Eden, as it were.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to have to ponder that, and I'm glad to hear Abraham is safe.
Yeah. Yes, Abraham, once we get into the story of Abraham, we're more dealing with historical figures or believed to be, and sometimes we come across legendary stories about them, for example, but the characters that in question, most scholars wouldn't call into question their actual existence. So we're no longer in the realm of mythology. And certainly when we get to the New Testament, we're certainly in the realm of history. It's much more recent than the stories of, say, Abraham and even Moses and so on.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question. Okay, Mary, I think your hand is up next.
Good morning.
Morning.
So I would like to add dreams to your list. And last night I had this in my dream, and I knew it had to do with this group. As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew that it was connected and going to be connected to what we were talking about today.
Isn't that beautiful? Yeah. And Mary, you're right. I mean, when we look at the role that dreams play. In fact, if you're in the using the Revised Common Lectionary of the Episcopal Church and others, where one of our readings in the Old Testament has been a semi-continuous reading of the story of Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat, and he's Joseph the dreamer. And we know in the New Testament of another dreamer, Joseph, who is the foster father, as it were, of Jesus. And the real role that these dreams play as divine communication. In fact, we have an Episcopal priest and Jungian psychologist in November is going to do an online course, retreat for us here out of St. Columba's on looking at dreams in this biblical sense of how they inform us of the divine and how they connect us to God. So anybody's interested, keep your eyes peeled for that. That'll happen in November. So he's a Jungian psychologist and also a priest who works closely with this dream work. And it's beautiful what our dreams can teach us about the divine in our relationship. Doesn't mean the dreams are historical, but they're real, right? I mean, there's something emerging through that that's deep. So thanks, Mary. That's a beautiful connection. All right, Rowan, I see your hand is up. I just want to make sure your mic.
You're
is
having
on.
trouble with sound breaking up? If you click the little minimizing line at the top of the screen and you get a tiny little box image, at least the sound will be continuous. So I was having because of bandwidth. But my question is, there's a lot of thought about focus on Genesis being about obedience, disobedience. But I heard a wonderful play about a man who gets taken on a trip to hell and a trip to heaven by Milton. And he was told first, you don't want to go to heaven. Heaven isn't, you won't be happy there. And heaven was a place where people saw things in a blinding clarity, and what they saw, which made them not happy, is being able to see the potential of human beings and how human beings fail. And so I wanted to ask you about the significance of that. It's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So that's my question.
Rowan, if I could just ask for clarification, when you talk about the tree of knowledge of good and evil, I'm not sure if I connected that to the first part of your comment. In other words, so I'm not sure what you're asking because I didn't, if you could.
The first part being that in this play, people in heaven have a great awareness of the potential in human beings for great good and to see and great self-realization, and to see, and are sad when they see how people fail. And so that's connected to that the transition in the Garden of Eden is to the knowledge of good and evil. And
right. So the way I, and by the way, is everybody experiencing me breaking up? No, okay, so most aren't, because it's, Rowan, I only say that it's hard for me to close the window because I need to see people in this case, but so as long as it's not a common experience. So I'll try to speak as clearly as I can. I think from a contemplative perspective, the way to think about the tree of knowledge of good and evil is that it stands as the temptation to strive for something as a commodity, as something we can possess outside of its proper place, which is relationship with the divine. In other words, it's a striving for autonomy and a rejection of theonomy. Theonomy meaning being rooted in God, autonomy being like an island unto ourselves. So I think what the tree of knowledge stands for is the temptation to try to be God apart from God. And the irony is that the only way in which our own divinity can be present in us is through the grace of Christ, through the incarnation, through relationship. And when we strive outside of relationship to achieve that knowledge, we actually, are striving for something we already possess in its rightful relational context. And we forsake intimate, loving relationship between humanity and divine for something that we see as just being a commodity or a thing we can possess outside of that context. And I think that becomes the metaphor or the symbol for the human condition that we all struggle with. Getting lost in trying to assert our autonomy rather than recognizing that heaven is already here, if you will, in our interrelationship, in the intimacy of our relationships that we have with one another and with the divine, that it's in relationship that we are fulfilled, not apart from it. And the temptation of the serpent, as it were, is to push us beyond the divine human relationship to try to be competitors with God rather than to receive the grace of God and therefore our own joy and fulfillment and destiny. And that's how I'll talk about it in the next section. So we'll have a chance to explore that further.
Oh, when I said about minimizing the screen, I didn't mean for you. I meant for those of us who are listening, so that you don't break up. If someone's having trouble with you breaking up, if they minimize the screen, it takes less bandwidth on their computer to do the images.
Got it.
So,
Okay. Yes.
Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Rowan. Richard, please.
Yes. Good morning, all. I'm reminded by what you just said of our brothers and sisters of the Muslim faith who begin with Bismillah, in the name of God, before they start anything, to help them remember that it's relational, and we are from Him. But I wanted to go back to that first screen you showed this morning, if you could possibly bring it up, about the projection and about the shadow. The first reading? Yes, please. So I read at the top part and released myself from being a sinner. And then I read at the bottom part that I'm wretched. Maybe both are true, or that humanity is capable of such wretchedness. And I know that I am capable of all wretchedness. And that owning that perhaps helps me to not project it while I try to pretend I am good. And last week you kindly revealed your own, you're down here with all of us and not separate from sin and error. So where I am at the moment is that my acknowledgement of my evil and capacity for evil helps me to not pretend to be good, and thus in trying to appear as good, project onto everyone else. And you mentioned Jung this morning, who writes that we need evil, that goodness of itself cannot dissolve good. So somewhere in all that, and in this first reading, I am in an examination and a hope for conversion. And I would love your comment on any part of this, or the part where Jung says we need evil.
So let me, I don't know that teaching of Jung or the context in which he said it, so I'm not sure I would be nervous to comment on that specific thing, because I'm not sure I understand what he's getting at when he says that. But I can speak to some of the other things that you talked about, Richard, and one of them would be, I think we've talked about before, and I think it's well recognized that we are living in a culture, and I'm speaking specifically of the United States, though I suspect it's probably true of many of your countries. We're living in a time, at least in the Western part of the world, as it were, that there is an increasing intolerance for complexity. Everything is being pushed to black and white, whether that's sides of the political aisle, religious convictions, one way or the other. And I think that spiritual maturity requires us, and psychological and emotional maturity requires us to be able to hold complexity and to be able to hold that within ourselves, to recognize we are complex beings, sometimes motivated subconsciously by things we don't even fully understand. And I think as we develop in the spiritual life, the ability to hold complexity about reality and about ourselves and our relationship to reality becomes essential because it's true. When we ask about the wretchedness of humanity, many of us, because of past experience and frankly institutional abuse around shame and guilt that was imposed on a lot of people, we want to recoil from that. And yet the truth of the matter is we can see in so many quarters of our planet the destruction of the environment, all manner of violence and racism. I mean, we are in many ways in a very sorry state in the world. And there's something wretched about that, right? When the truth that Christianity wants to affirm is that we were created to be in harmonious, beautiful, intimate relationship with the divine. What the story of Eden is asking is, if that's true, if God is a God of love who created us to be in loving relationship with the divine, then how come every time I open up a newspaper, everything seems to be about war and violence and destruction and so forth? Where does that come from, if not from God? And Eden tries to explain that, the origins of those things. So it's trying to tell us to hold out the truth of that wretchedness that we both participate in and are made victims of, but that there remains this infinite and eternal optimism in Christianity, that wretchedness does not have the final say. It doesn't even have the first say. The first say is that we were created innocent. We were created good. God saw creation and looked and said, it is good, right? So there is a primordial goodness to humanity. What we call wretchedness or sinfulness is always regarded in Christianity as a second moment, not something that's central to who we are, but something that gets glommed on in a second moment. And that thing that gets glommed on, that the crisis of our fall from grace, as it were, the amelioration for that is not a denial of the fact that we can do terrible things or involved in a world where terrible things are done to us, but that the grace of God transcends it. That somehow above all of that, the beauty of God's love, of God's grace continues to shine, continues to transform, continues to have the final say and the last word, and always will. But you have to see the beauty of that grace-filled persistence of God's love in order to really appreciate and understand that. You cannot start with a denial of the fact that we have made a mess of things. You have to accept that fact, because to deny it is, well, if you'll pardon me, it's psychotic. You cannot look at the world and not see the mess we've made of it. So there has to be an honest admission of that piece of it, that there's war and violence and so forth. And then comes the grace of recognizing that beyond, above, and greater than that is this infinite, eternal invitation of grace that will, in a sense, as the modern slogan says, love will always win. This is the Christian optimism, but you have to be able to hold both, because both, I think, are true. And even though we sometimes want to skirt, as I mentioned in a previous session, Good Friday and just jump to Easter Sunday, those 2 days are held together as one, in a sense, one ongoing moment of salvation on the from cross to resurrection. And you cannot have resurrection without the cross. So we have to be able to somehow hold both of those things as true in the world as much as true somehow within ourselves. And that's the beauty of it. And the early contemplatives of the desert, the Egyptian desert, the Christian mothers and fathers there have, repeatedly talked about this notion of penthos, where they would be reduced to tears at the recognition of those two things, that I cannot love God as much as God loves me. I'm just not capable of it. And that brings a certain pain into my heart, a certain desire to want to love God as much as I am loved. And when we realize we can't, we're sort of reduced to tears, but they're tears not only of pain, but of profound joy, because in that complexity, I realize that I am loved infinitely. And that becomes, for many of us within the contemplative life, transforming moments. Usually we're reduced to sort of a tearful state of joy, but also of mixed regret. And it's that fine line that blends those, the complexity of holding those two things at once, that becomes so transformational. Tina, I see your hand is up. By the way, welcome. I'm not sure that I've seen you before.
No, we haven't.
Okay, well, welcome. Where are you coming in from?
Portugal.
Oh, very nice. Welcome. It's good to have you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I just want to, I'm not sure I have so much as a question as just wanting to share what came up for me with the first reading.
Of course.
So I'm a person who can't take in that many words. So the second reading, I'm just, I don't know what it said. So yeah, I don't need the screen. No, it's fine.
Oh, you don't? Okay.
Fine. So so what came up for me was again a contact with this conditioned I, the Tina who is able to see God in a particular way, and the way that I could really feel I got in contact with this part of me that's actually able to hate and be and feel separate due to that. And so a part of me that I feel that's not yet resolved. But the way that I work with it is just to be with it. And I could feel then, if I become that, if God becomes somebody who can judge me in a particular way, who is it that then who do I become? And I can feel this narrow way of being in myself. It becomes very small, and it becomes very a tight space where I'm fearful of letting myself go and become wider and open. And yeah, so when you're talking about the denial, you call it psychosis. For me, inside of me, it feels really like a split. Like, I can do something with my, believe in being all good. Then I realize, oh my God, I nearly kicked the cat or something, or I'm angry with my husband or whatever. So I'm splitting those parts off still, my own negative traits, and not wanting to be with them. And but what I actually feel when I dig deeper in is actually what I'm getting in contact with is the separateness. A felt sense of being separate that I feel all the way into my own being and into the flesh and into the belly and the pain of that. There's a pain. I'm able to contain that pain, but I can feel that pain. So it's really in this moment it feels that way, that there's a separateness that I still view and perceive myself as being a separate entity.
Yes.
And I think that is painful. It feels like pain to be that separate entity. And I think it's all conditioned in the way, if I look back and see, well, I think it's the human condition to be separate from the very beginning, to feel that separateness all the way back to when you had to become separate from your mother, or that deep wound that's there. And so when you talk about the sustained interior gaze, yeah, to stay with that kind of opens up the world again. Not seeking something particular from outside, it's kind of opening up the world again. So it's a whole, I don't know if it makes sense, but I can see it's a whole sense. It links onto one thing after the other, about feeling separate, feeling where fear is coming from, how hate can evolve or become a thing out of that separateness, the felt sense of being separate or being deeply hurt, and then projecting it onto God. Yeah. So that's what I think. That's why it all came up with the projection. So how do I see myself, and what does God become in that world of my own? Because it's just a conditioned view. It's not true. There's something about it I know that's not true. So that's also, there's a part of me that knows that that's not true, but there's still a part of me that acts as if that is the truth also.
Right. This is the continual, if you want to say, struggle with the interior life or with the contemplative life, is the grappling with the false perception, which is the ongoing temptation to eat from the tree of knowledge, right? I think you've, in the course of your beautiful reflection, you've named a kind of connection. Fear gives rise to anger, which gives rise to hate, which gives rise to violence. So all of the violence in the world, I think, can ultimately be rooted to a kind of fear of one kind or another. Somehow the perceived enemy feels they're threatening me or my way of life or my ideology or my belief system or something. And we notice that anger is a distancing emotion. It's very hard, for example, you've heard a lot of therapists say, when you're arguing with your spouse, sit facing each other and hold hands the whole time and don't let go. It's very difficult when you're angry to do that, but it's requiring you, I think, to stay connected, to stay intimate, even through the feelings, right? So a lot of therapists I've heard recommend those types of practices. Because anger wants to distance, and that distancing is really giving into that perception that you're talking about, of that struggle to see the separateness. For you and I not to recognize, as Paul would say, do you not know that you are members of the same body? When you hate someone, you don't want to perceive them as members of the same body of which you're a part. That feels psychotic, right? That feels like a split. And what the gospel is calling us to, what the contemplative life is calling us, is to move beyond that and to get in touch with that sustained gaze. What is the source of that violence, that hatred, that anger, that fear? And how do we sustain that gaze long enough to return to that understanding, because then dissipates the things that emerge from that fear. But you are naming the practice. That is what we're doing in many ways, is in various angles. The contemplative life is about, in a sense, refusing the serpentine, the serpent of Eden, refusing that temptation to be separate, to be in control, to achieve something for ourselves, and instead remaining in the garden where we can stay in that beautiful intimacy with God and therefore everyone. That serpent is still tempting us today. That's the beauty of the narrative. It isn't just about our primeval parents, eons ago. That story is about our experience of God, our temptations, our fears, right? Our shame, our intimacy with the divine. It's our story. We're Adam and Eve. And so I think you've named what is a near universal experience. But the beauty is how well you're observing what you're observing. You're becoming aware of the awareness, as it were. And being able to see that from that distance is what gives us the ability to transcend it ultimately.
Yeah, and when you're sitting with it, I also felt humble, because actually I for a long time I haven't felt that kind of energy in myself, like, oh God, it's still here. Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Tina. It's a beautiful reflection. Okay, so Dwight, how about we'll take your question and then we'll move on to a discussion of practice, by all means.
Yeah, I'm aware of the time that is well over. What I was thinking is that commenting, get your comments on your last question regarding the second paragraph you read. Or if you prefer, we can leave this for the next section next week. I don't mind at all. It's just something
I'm
that
happy to look
occurred
at
to
it.
me.
Would you like me to share the second paragraph?
No, I've got it here in my on the book.
Okay. So I'm sorry, Dwight, did I miss, what was your question?
Yeah, just a brief comment on that question. You said before that this will be addressed in certain some length in the next few sessions. But I was just trying to jump the gun, so to speak, and get a brief comment from you on that regard. But if possible, if not, I'm happy to wait.
No, I'm very, you know what though, Dwight, somehow or another, I'm missing exactly what you want me to comment on. Somehow I've not caught that. I'm so sorry. What part, so you want me to just comment on the second paragraph? You mean try to offer more on that or something specific? Dwight, you'll have to unmute yourself, sorry.
Sorry. The last question in the second paragraph.
Oh, last question. Okay, for those who don't have the book, I'll quickly put that up then real quick. So you're talking about then this.
Correct.
Okay, how then might a contemplative reading of Genesis account of Eden help to frame our understanding of the movement of the Christian interior life? Right, so this in a sense is the content of this second chapter, really. It's really trying to help us, in a sense, do what I started to say in my comments earlier today, to find a way to understand, that what makes a myth is that it's a story that never happened historically, but is always happening within the heart of every believer, as it were. That's what makes myth. It's not a fable. It's a story that's really reflecting the interior life of every individual, rather than a separate story about somebody who we never met thousands of years ago. It's our story. And so the way that the early church examined this story and made sort of mystical sense of it, or sense of it about when exploring the interior life, is to understand the dynamic at play with regard to how Eden serves as that place that represents divine human union. And as we'll talk about, that whole narrative that all religions seem to have, where there seems to be some primordial union that gets disrupted for some reason. In our case, it's because of the disobedience of eating fruit, forbidden fruit, then sends us on this spiritual, right, exile, and where humanity is now constantly searching for that union again. And that's the way that we'll be talking about this particular story, to show the uniqueness of the way in which the Jewish Christian tradition speaks. This is our narrative around that universal spiritual theme of original union leading to a place of exile or a place of disunion or of fragmentation, and then that human search for meaning, the confrontation of that inner void, right? The fear of death, all of those things that drive us to search for that unity with God again. And then how the next chapter will specifically show how, in our case as Christians, the incarnation becomes the amelioration of that suffering. And I'm not sure, Dwight, if you've actually read that far in the book, if you know what I'm talking about, but we'll look at the story of the prodigal son, and we see that story has the same basic pattern as Eden, of an original union between father and son, and then the son goes off into his own self-imposed exile, and the father rushes out to greet him. This dynamic becomes a similar one that we see in Eden. And so we're going to explore how, if you overlay those stories, if you see the myth of Eden read through Jesus's parable of the prodigal son, you see that the myth of Eden gets retold through the coming of Christ in the incarnation. It isn't we who find God, but God who comes out to find us, like the Father who rushes out to bring us home. And this becomes very central for the way in our own interior life as Christians, I think we're to understand what's happening when we meditate, what the contemplative life is about and what it's not about. It's not about achieving enlightenment. It's not about making ourselves worthy before God. It's about accepting the fact that in the incarnation, God has come out to greet us like the Father and the prodigal son, and to bring us home. That's a done deal historically, right? That Christ already has come and through grace dwells in our hearts. That is the bringing homeness of the spiritual journey for Christians. So there's nothing to achieve. There's only something to accept. And that is this gracious, what we talked about in our paragraphs today, this amazing grace that despite the fact that we have exiled ourselves from God, like the prodigal son, the love of God is sustained throughout that. And in fact, doesn't just wait for us to return home, but rushes out and brings us home. And that is what we call the incarnation. That's the historical moment of that beauty. That very much has an influence on what we're to understand is happening in the contemplative life. If we mistake, it's not about methods, it's not about practice, it's not about achieving enlightenment, it's not about a goal. It's merely about starting to live in the present moment in which this amazing grace is already operative, is already awakening and transforming us even now. And it's our job in the contemplative life to simply let God be God and do the work that God rendered through Christ in the incarnation. That is, in a sense, the shorthand of it, if that helps. Sorry, Dwight, you're muted. I know it's hard to remember that. I think you're good now. Nope, still.
Yeah.
There.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that. And your words saying there's nothing to achieve, nothing to grasp or aim for, but really to be receptive to. That's the essence of it, really. Thank you for that.
You're welcome, Dwight. And just as a final comment, and we'll look at practice, that, a lot of people then conclude from that, then what is the point of ethics, Christian morals? What does it mean? Why be good if it's already a done deal? And we'll talk about that too, that if you're trying to be good to save yourself, that's just modern day Pharisaism. Goodness, the Christian life of virtue or ethics is not a life of trying to prove ourselves worthy. It is, in fact, a life lived in gratitude for what God has already done, to realize those types of, to be not virtuous, to live an unethical life is beneath us. We are heirs to the divine, right? We are heirs to share the throne with God. So that, in a sense, what comes out of the Christian contemplative life then is a response to this great, this wonderful thing that God has done in us. Right, and that will be made clear as we continue to read on. All right, so there's certainly room for ethics in there. Christine, I'm going to just hold your comment for a bit. I know some people will have to go, but if you just keep your hand raised, we'll come to you before, and for whoever can stick around. I did want to communicate the practice for the day. or for the week, so that people have that if they need to run. And here it is. Okay. So here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to ask you to reflect on a situation in your life that at first felt like a tragedy, something that was perhaps a disappointment, an unwelcomed change, the death of a dream or plans you had or hopes that you had held out. And observe with hindsight how that moment may have led to a new, unexpected, or wonderful outcome, something completely unanticipated. And as you recall that experience, I want you to meditate on this. Where in hindsight now do you see the hand of God in that experience? Right? I think many of us have had that experience where something very disappointing happens, and then we think, wow, in the future, we think to ourselves, if that disappointing thing didn't happen, I would be in a very different situation now, and what amazing gifts have emerged from that. So then, drawing from that past experience, trust where the hand of God may be in current disappointments, where indeed the hand of God may be transforming human tragedy into divine comedy. And then as your practice, I just want you to rest in that trust. So let me say that the thrust of the exercise this week is to help you see in hindsight how the hand of God has been working in your life. And it's always easier to see in hindsight, but then to allow that hindsight to inform maybe a current situation you're struggling with, and to rest in that sense of trust. And what does that feel like to rest in that trust in a current situation or disappointment? And ask what it means to sort of let go of outcomes and trust that indeed providence will guide into some new and unexpected reality. So that would be my invitation for you this week. And Robert, you'll be able to post that, right? Because I know there was a lot of words there for those who.
Joanne will be sending it out, and then I'll put it on Facebook.
Okay, perfect.
Yes,
Perfect. Okay.
It will go up today.
Okay, perfect. All right. Okay, so then that brings us very quickly to our discussion of our practice from last week, also a lengthy description. So I was asking for you in your practice to sit quietly on a daily basis and to attend to any feelings within you might describe as fear, anxiety, or hurt, and to simply observe those feelings. And to ask where it lives in you, in what part of the body it's manifest. Does it come in waves? Is it persistent? Is it a simple drain on your energy? Does it distract you from the present moment? Does this feeling have a certain voice or sound? And if so, what does it say to you? Can you picture what it might look like, its color, texture, or shape? So can we give it some kind of form? Is the feeling associated with a particular memory, or is it attached to some future event that perhaps you're anxious about or you fear? And when you've come to know this feeling more intimately, I would invite you to imagine yourself holding it as you might a vulnerable child, and assure the feeling that you're aware of it, you will attend to it, and to thank it for what it's communicating to you. And then begin to inquire what vulnerable aspect of yourself you're relating to, and to know that in this you are practicing self-care. So that was the sort of the question, to sit with this thing that's making you feel uneasy or anxious or fearful, to relate to it, to even try to give it shape and form, to identify where it expresses in your body, and then to attend to it, to comfort yourself in dealing with it, and to let that be a sort of a healing meditation on self-care. So this was all coming out of that the readings that we had around the inner child, as it were, as the 1980s self-help movement, but really trying to look at how we might move beyond that into care of oneself. So is there anyone who would like to share? Christine, I know your hand is already up, so so just feel free to jump in if there's something you want to share at this point, and you can keep your hand raised there. But I open the floor if anybody wants to share their experience of this practice. Sure, Mary, go right ahead.
Anxiety is pretty much a foreign feeling for me, but I've been able to identify it in the last, I'd say, month. It's come up, and it came up again this morning, not in this group, in another group from a reading. And what I can relate to is that whenever there is this distinction between goodness and evil, as if it's a split, as if there is something pure in goodness and the opposite is evil, I recognize that I become very anxious. And I've had to really sit with this in a group that I'm taking on white supremacy. And I think I shared this last week, where everybody is white. And there's this anxiety about that this isn't real, that what I'm being told is not real, that there really is not a purity of goodness or a purity of evil. In fact, we are all of that. And I'm still coming to terms with that. And I'm sure as the next 2 or 3 months happen, that will be raised again and again and again. But I've had to really hold that in myself.
I'm going to quickly look something. Do you have a copy of the book, Mary, by any chance?
I do, but I don't have it with me. I do.
That's okay. I'm gonna recommend. There's something I write in over the course of a couple of sections that addresses that question of the distinction. And let me see if I can quickly find it for you. Yeah, if you look on if you just go to page 88 to the end of the chapter there. So just that's all you have to remember is page 88 and just read the several pages to the end of that chapter. It's a section that I write on where I look at the inner Herod, who is in a sense that aspect of ourselves. You call it evil if you want, or the false self, or egotism, or striving, that wants to suppress or deny or thwart the birth of Christ within us. And what I try to do in that section is to distinguish what the inner Christ from the inner Herod ultimately is about. And I don't put them on an equal par, meaning that to your question this morning, where you say, well, I have this anxiety around that there's pure goodness. It feels like we're everything. I think we do indeed experience ourselves as both the goodness or the Christ nature and the Herod. But what I try to help point out in that section is that the true depth, the true core, the true center is Christ, and Herod is but a passing nuisance, if you want to say. And even though that Herod can exert tremendous power over us, now the destiny of Herod, I sort of look at these two men as kings, King Herod and Christ the King, and that they're both destined to die. The difference being that Christ will rise, right, and remain sort of Lord of history. And but for his connection to Christ, Herod will all but disappear from history. And that, in a sense, I think speaks to what I believe is the Christian conviction around what the true depth of your goodness is, even though in moments Herod can really feel like he's the one enthroned, that's the one in charge, or that's the voice in control. I think the insistence of the gospel is that is part of the lie, that is part of the temptation to believe that. And so if you read that page 88 and following, you may well come to a way in which I try to speak to that anxiety you're experiencing.
Thank you.
Sure, you're welcome. So let me, as we're, feel free to if you're interested in raising your hand, but let me come to Christine's question in the meantime, and then, but we can come to the question of practice. Just raise your hand if you'd like to. So Christine, did you want to voice your comment?
Well, yeah, it's not so much a question, except that as Dwight was talking, remembering the story of the Garden of Eden and the fact that God makes clothes for Adam and Eve, and how we as Christians are clothed with Christ. And that it seems to me
The last thing you said, we as Christians.
are clothed with Christ.
Yes, right.
And the realization that within us is our true self, which is always connected with God. And it seems like the Christian life is a process of letting go of everything that is not that true one connected with God from the very beginning and always.
That's right. That's right. There's a section I'll talk about in this chapter called borrowed clothing, which addresses that very thing of God clothing Adam and Eve on some level as they are moving into their exile, and how that is paralleled in the way that the Father clothes his Son when he returns home with the restoration of his dignity in the community. And how that links to the baptismal garment of white that we don in our baptisms, which is to be clothed with Christ, to your point, which is in a sense, the paradox of that is to be really made naked again. To be clothed with Christ is to return to that naked union of Eden. And that, by the way, is also symbolically expressed in the priest's alb, which is really the baptismal garment, and also the monk's cowl, that big robe that the contemplative monks wear when they move into their place of prayer. It's a voluminous garment. It's huge. It's like putting on a tent with long sleeves that actually drape all the way to the floor. If your hands hang next to your sides, the sleeves end at your ankles, not at your wrists. And you have to kind of push back those sleeves to get your hands out. The idea is and I talk about the theology of dress and the theology of the cowl as being that garment which envelops us in that nakedness, that intimacy with Christ again, and that its sheer volume and its beauty is such that that when you have it on, one of the only things you can do without fearing mishap is to sit and be still, because trying to do anything in it, you're bound to knock something over or trip on yourself or whatever. So there's a way in which the voluminous nature of a cowl, which again is being clothed with Christ, which is the symbol for being naked with Christ, or back in that nakedness of Eden, almost requires you to do nothing but be in the present moment, to be still in that naked union. So I do address the symbology of dress very soon, I think, in the book. It's upcoming, so it speaks to that point, and I couldn't agree with you more. Yeah, I always tell people, whenever there's clothing mentioned in the Bible, pay close attention, because there is almost inevitably something theological about it. The fact, for example, that David danced naked around the ark when it was rushed back into Jerusalem says something about his intimacy with God, right? As the Ark of the Covenant is ushered back into Jerusalem and so forth. There's a lot of or in the Garden of Gethsemane, this strange thing that Mark has in his gospel, where when the soldiers come to arrest Christ, there's some like random young man like in the garden, and he's wearing nothing but a toga, I guess you could say, like a sheet, and the guards, mistaking him for one of the apostles, grabs for him, and he escapes only by slipping out of that garment, and they're left holding his garment, and he runs away naked. I mean, there's symbolism there. Like, what is that? It's such a strange text, and so strange that both Matthew and Luke dropped it when they come to their telling of the story, because I don't think they knew what to do with it. But I think that Mark very much had something intentional there about the nakedness, and in this case, the shame that the apostles feel in their betrayal. I think there's something metaphorical happening there in that story. So whenever you see clothing, pay attention. Something's being communicated. One way or another, yeah. So other thoughts or questions, either about content or about practice before we close for today? And again, you're spanning a couple screens here, so if you don't mind raising your electronic hand, or just if you don't know how to do that, just jump in.
I just hope if we have a retreat at St. Columba's, we're not going to all get naked.
Hasn't happened yet. Hasn't happened yet, right? All right.
I hold very tightly to the fact that God loves me because he loves me. There is nothing that I can do that's going to make him love me more, and nothing that I can do that'll make him love me less. God loves me because he loves me. And knowing that God is shining that divine light on that which is good in me, that is that which is of him, gives me the confidence to be still and let that develop in me. Let it grow in me. So it's been a wonderful session, Father Vincent. Another wonderful session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Robert. I appreciate that so much. And thank you for those closing comments. It cuts through all of the red tape and says what it's really all about. So thank you for that, as always. All right, then. I hope to see you all back next Saturday. I wish you a happy Feast of the Dormition or Assumption, depending on your tradition. And I hope that you have a very blessed, a very safe and healthy week ahead. So stay well and take good care. Okay, and Benum Christianet. Thank you for being.